All right, so next lecture today will be on the lymphatic system and immunity, as you can see on the title slide there. And plain and simple, in sort of the back of your mind while you're thinking about this and learning about it, this system defends ourselves, right? It's how our body defends from pathogens and microorganisms and viruses and bacteria and other types of things that could do harm to our body. So again, the lymphatic system protects us from disease, and there we have specialized cells in our body that are designed to respond to these things that may enter our system. Environmental pathogens, like it says, toxins, cancer cells, other abnormal types of cells, sort of the way we can defend ourselves. So always want to be thinking about defense when you talk about lymphatic system. So pathogens then, again, are things that can do us harm. They can cause damage to cells and cause disease, and could be any number of things. Like I said, it could be a virus, a bacteria, a parasite of some kind, other microorganisms that can invade our system, and they're each going to attack in their own way. And so we have different types of cells, and really sort of this coordinated response that you'll see in an effort to protect ourselves. But as we'll also find out, it's not something completely, our immune system's not completely developed when we're born. It's something part of we have naturally born with, and part of it we develop over time. So we'll talk about those things. So what are things that help defend us? Well, generally speaking, they're called lymphocytes that are part of this lymphatic system, and their lymphocytes then are sort of on the lookout and basically identify. That's the first step, to recognize and appropriately attack and identify the specific pathogen or normal cells to eradicate it or eliminate it from our body. But then also over time develop immunity to things that we recognize that our body protects ourselves from over time. So immunity then, what is that? Well, that's the ability to resist infection, right? And so, as I said before, there are different types of immunity. Innate immunity is what we're born with in ways that we can defend ourselves right from birth and on through. It's not very specific. It doesn't distinguish between any specific types of cells, and we'll talk a lot about that. And the other type of immunity, in a way we defend ourselves, is adaptive, or immunity that we develop over time, and it's also very specific. It targets specific cells in different specific manners. And those are carried out primarily by lymphocytes. So you have this sort of duality, one that you're born with and that is not specific in terms of defending ourselves, and then one that you're not born with, right? And it takes time. It's adaptive. It takes time for your body to learn this defense. But it is very specific. So we'll look further at that. And really all the body's cells and tissues are contributed in some way to immunity. And so we'll look at how that works. So what is this lymphatic system made of? Well, you have this lymphatic vessel system, right? Kind of like blood vessels. The lining is not quite as complete, but basically it's a lymphatic vessel. These vessels are throughout our body, kind of like a superhighway throughout our body. And they carry lymph, which is this fluid that's similar to plasma. Like a fluid, like plasma is sort of a water-based fluid, but does not have plasma proteins. Lymphoid tissue and lymphoid organs, we'll talk about those. And then finally, lymphocytes, phagocytic, and other cells are also found in this lymphatic system. And so here you can get a feel with this image, sort of what we're talking about. You've probably heard of lymph nodes. These are just lymph nodes in certain locations that essentially link and are larger areas for lymphatic fluids and link adjacent sections. And so you can see the lymphatic vessels really, travel throughout the body, and some other lymphatic organs that we're going to talk about. The thymus we'll look at, the spleen, other locations, and then of course lymphocytes that are in the fluid of the lymph, and so we'll talk about that as well. And then here you can see the lower part of the body. The appendix also is considered to be associated with the lymphatic tissue, although we'll probably talk about that more when we look at digestion as that's, appendix is off of your large intestine. All right? All right, so that gives us a nice overview of some of the components. And so, again, the function of the lymphatic system is to produce, to maintain, distribute these lymphocytes throughout the body so that you can adequately defend yourself throughout your life. Here, any pathogens and bacteria and other types of things you come in contact with. Lymphocytes then come from bone marrow, as we saw when we looked at blood. We saw lymphocytes being produced there, but they're also produced like in lymphoid tissue, like the tonsils, and also lymphoid organs like the spleen and the thymus. And again, these lymphocytes are distributed throughout the body to protect. And as you guys know, some of them don't reside in the blood. They actually go out into the connective tissue, and they can migrate and travel to the site of infection when they recognize the appropriate pathogen. All right, so lymphatic vessels, again, as I said before, these are the vessels that carry the lymphatic fluid that has lymphocytes. And again, it's sort of like a vessel system, kind of like we looked at when we talked about blood vessels. But this one, the membrane and the lining is not quite as complete, and the endothelial cells aren't as tightly bound together as you typically see with vessels. And basically it acts as a one-way valve, allowing bacteria and viruses and other types of things to enter these vessels, right? And so that's one way that they can try to consume these and eradicate these from the body. Found, pretty much in all portions of the body except the central nervous system, as I said, is sort of like a superhighway throughout the body. And as we've talked about before, if you took my MP1 class, we talked about like colon cancers and other types of cancers, that oftentimes the lymphatic system is an easy way for cancer cells to metastasize or spread throughout the body. And so that's why oftentimes if you have a cancer in a certain area, not only will the oncologist try to remove the cancerous cells, of course, but they'll also probably do a lymph node resection in that area to try to prevent metastasis from occurring or, prevent it from happening if the cancer does come back. So anyway, so those are lymphatic vessels. And here you can get a nice image, sort of what they look like. You can see the difference between an arterial and a venule and a capillary. And then you have these lymphatic vessels sort of right adjoining close to them. And if you look closely, let me see if I can get my highlighting tool here. If you look closely, you can see how they have sort of an incomplete lining, right? You look at the lining of the vessel, right? And so it allows for things to sort of enter into this lymphatic section. This is a really nice image sort of showing a cross-section through a lymphatic vessel. And you can appreciate that incomplete lining that I was talking about. So that's sort of different from what we see with blood vessels, okay? All right, so what about lymphocytes? What types of lymphocytes are there? Again, lymphocytes are these actual cells that actually seek out and destroy and attack these pathogens that are in our body. And so we need to get to familiarize yourselves with what types of lymphocytes there are. And there are actually three different categories, roughly. You have T cells, B cells, and natural killer cells. And the first two categories, T cells and B cells, really speak more to where these lymphocytes get their education. Oftentimes it's called education, how these cells are educated. What I mean by that is your lymphatic cells need to be able to recognize and differentiate between normal cells, what they should avoid and not attack, and what they should attack. And so where they get their education and how they learn what they're supposed to identify is where they get their names. So T cells really are developed and formed and dependent on thymic or the thymus hormone. B cells are more bone marrow derivatives, and so they get their quote-unquote education through the bone marrow. And so having these two different categories of cells allows them to learn properly where they're supposed to attack and what they're supposed to look for. And when that doesn't happen, when they incorrectly, which is a very common thing in the body, unfortunately, when our lymphocytes incorrectly target normal, healthy tissue instead of pathogens, that is autoimmune disease, right? So we've talked about some autoimmune stuff before. But anyway, so those are T cells and B cells. And finally, this third category are called natural killer cells, or NK cells. So we'll talk about these different types. So T cells, the thymic educated or thymus-dependent cells make up 80%, right? Vast majority of circulating lymphocytes, and there's actually a lot of different types of T cells. We have cytotoxic, memory helper, and suppressor T cells. Okay? Cytotoxic C cells produce what's called cell-mediated immunity, which I was talking about previously, and they directly attack cells infected by viruses. Memory T cells are formed in response to some sort of pathogen, but they remain in our body to give us immunity, right? We talked about immunity and how our body can, remember these things that happen and allow us to attack things a little more efficiently if and when they return. Helper T cells are very important because they help stimulate the function and formation of both T cells and B cells, so they have a contributory effect there. Suppressor T cells inhibit the function of T cells and B cells. You might think, well, why would you have suppressor T cells? Well, you don't always want your immune system, your defense system to be active on, high alert. You need them to back off once the job is done, right? Because you have your body takes a certain response when the immune response is occurring. So I also want to be able to inhibit the function of those T cells and B cells. And finally, regulatory T cells are just helper and suppressor T cells. But again, sort of kind of like I was talking about with suppressor, they help sort of control and regulate that sensitivity of the immune response and have it, turn it on and turn it off, so to speak, in terms of the response. All right. Now, the other category of cells are B cells, or the primary category, or B cells, and that makes up 10 to 15% of the lymphocytes. And these B cells are different because they differentiate into what are called plasma cells. And plasma cells are going to have a sort of a different route for immunity and defense, and they do this by producing and secreting antibodies. Antibodies are immunoglobulin proteins that basically bind to a target and eradicate things in that way. So you have different antibodies. We'll talk about these later, different types of antibodies. But it's sort of an alternate defense route for the body with these B cells. Okay? So antigens again have the ability to bind to a target and then lead to a destruction of that target via an antigen. So we call this antibody-mediated immunity. This is a different sort of chain of events that targets, instead of cell-mediated immunity, which is a direct cell action where it's targeting and consuming and destroying that cell. This is doing it through antibodies or through the antigens. So anyway, that's a system that we'll talk about a little bit later. Then the last 5 to 10% of these cells are called natural killer cells. And natural killer cells are responsible for what's called immunological surveillance, where they are constantly on the lookout and attack foreign cells or other virus cells that have been impacted by viruses of some kind, or cancer cells, for instance. These are sort of larger lymphocytes that are generally on the lookout. Okay, and so here's a nice sort of overview of these different classes of lymphocytes. Again, T cells make up 80%. So you make sure you know what cytotoxic, helper, suppressor, and memory T cells are. We talked about all those different functions. This is just more of a visual of the same thing I just went over. And then B cells, again, make up 10 to 15%. These ultimately are going to be converted into what are called plasma cells, which will produce and secrete antibodies. And then finally, natural killer cells make up the last percentage. And we'll talk a little bit more in detail about those. All right, so lymphocytes are distributed throughout the body. Different tissues have different populations of T cells and B cells. Lymphocytes can wander through tissues. We've talked about that before. They enter blood vessels and lymphatics through support and can survive for many years. You saw them in connective tissue, for instance, and that's important because they want to be able to sort of have this migratory ability, because you're going to have infection at any various locations in your body. So we want them to be able to grab that and target those different locations. Okay. So T cells and B cells, again, migrate throughout the body to defend these tissues, retain their ability to divide, which is essential to the immune system function, right? It's not the greatest analogy, but you can really sort of use a military analogy, right? You get troops on the ground, the more troops you have, the better chance you have of defeating the enemy. And that's sort of what happens in these cells. You get more and more of these cells, and they divide, they're going to get stronger, and they're going to overtake, hopefully overtake the pathogen that has entered our system. All right, so B cells differentiate, as I said, with exposure to certain hormones like interleukin-7. These are bone marrow derivative. T cells differentiate with those to thymic hormones, right, because those are thymus dependent cells, so B cells and T cells. Lymphoid organs, again, we talked about lymph nodes already, talked about the thymus, talked a little bit about the spleen in terms of what those do. Lymph nodes, again, are these larger sections of lymphatic vessels. They're very small lymphoid organs. The largest, greatest ones are like in your neck and armpits, and lymph nodes are often one of the first signs of infection, right? Because you're going to have more fluid and more cells and other types of activity going on in this lymphatic vessels, and so these lymph nodes will swell up. So maybe a doctor might check your lymph nodes to palpate those in your neck or in your armpit to see if they're in fact swollen, which may be indication of an infection of some kind. And so you can see those lymph nodes. I've already sort of seen that picture before. So the lymph node function, they really sort of act like a filter, right? They purify the lymph before it returns to the venous circulation, removing debris and pathogens and antigens. But again, it also functions as an early warning system that your immune system is very active, right? Lymphoid tissues and lymph nodes monitor these infections and respond before these infections can target locations. You have lymph nodes in the gut and trachea and the lungs, protect against pathogens in these digestive and respiratory areas. When we do digestion and respiratory, you'll see there are lymphatic vessels or lymphatic cells, right in those specific areas, because if you think about it, through our mouth down into our lungs and into our stomach, that's an easy way for bacteria and pathogens and other types of things to enter our system. So you want to have some lymphatic activity in those areas. And so when we do digestion and respiration, where you'll be able to take note of the way our body can defend ourselves in those locations, because that's an easy way for pathogens to enter. Okay? All right, so lymph nodes, as I said, these large lymph nodes at the groin and the base of the neck swell in response to inflammation because of an increase in lymphocytes and phagocytes in the lymph nodes, and they may swell, right? Lymphadenopathy is when you have a sort of enlargement or excessive enlargement of lymph nodes, which, if it's long-term, may indicate some very serious infection, maybe an endocrine disorder, or perhaps cancer, as your body is trying to defend itself from that. Right? The thymus, as I said, is the site of T cell formation. Thymus is located in the mediastinum, and actually goes through an atrophy period. It gradually gets smaller and smaller as we age after puberty, and so our immune system really is not as robust as we get older and older and older, and so that's why we're more susceptible to cancers and other types of things as we age, because our immune system just is not as robust, and the thymus loses and atrophies essentially as we get older. Okay? The thymus is divided into these two thymic lobes. You can see the thymus right here, located in the mediastinum. There are the two lobes, right and left lobe. Different lobules make up the tissue of the thymus. Lymphocytes divide in the cortex, T cells migrate in the medulla, and then ultimately leave the thymus into the blood vessels and beyond the body. And so here's just sort of a histological section of a lobule of the thymus. Okay? So as I said, there are these thymic hormones that help the development and the maintenance of the immune system. So thymosin promotes the development and formation of these lymphocytes. And so this hormone has several complementary hormones, and so collectively we call them thymic hormones, as I was mentioning before. And so these thymic hormones work together, and they help defend or help produce and form and develop T cells, which again are the vast majority of cells. The spleen has a large collection of lymphoid tissue in the body. As we know, we saw some functions of the spleen as associated to the cardiovascular system. One of the big things is that it stores iron and recycled components from red blood cells. So there are platelets and other types of things found in the spleen. But also it helps with removal of abnormal blood cells and initiation of the immune response, right? Because it's going to stimulate T cell and B cell formation as things are moving. So spleen will play a significant role in our body's defense as well. And so here you can see the spleen. You guys know the spleen from back in ANP2 when we were looking at that. ANP1 at the very beginning of the semester when we did all the organ systems. And there's a nice shot of the spleen in terms of its organization. All right, so what we want to do next is start looking more specifically at how our body defends itself, okay? And as I said, there are basically two categories of defenses: innate or nonspecific defense, and then adaptive or specific defense, right? This is how our body provides resistance and able to fight off infection, illness, and disease, okay? And as I said, innate, you know what innate means, right? It means you're born with it, right? It's something that you don't need to develop over time. It comes built into your body, right? And so this is also, though, non-specific, right? So we're born with it, but it's defending against anything. Like your good example would be your skin, for instance, right? Your skin, you guys know, is made of stratified squamous epithelium, and it's very thick and is not specific to anything. It just wants to block anything from getting in, right? And so it's non-specific. But also, we're born with skin, obviously, and so it's innate. Okay? The other type is adaptive or specific defense, right? And these things are defenses that take time to develop, right? And they protect against specific pathogens, right? And they depend on lymphocytic activity, right? So it's specific resistance developed after exposure to environmental hazards, right? So when we're born, we haven't been exposed to anything yet, right? And so over time, why kids get sick so easily when they're young, right? They get colds and other times because they're developing this type of immunity, adaptive. So there's really two components to each, right? Innate and non-specific, adaptive and specific. So make sure you understand that from the different, you know, include both parts when you're talking about these two types of defense systems. All right, so the first we're going to look at is non-specific defensive or innate, right? And so there are 7 major categories of innate non-specific defensive. Physical barriers, which I sort of already mentioned, like the skin, for instance. Phagocytes, right, which are just general cells that have the ability, like Pac-Man, right, that can consume and eradicate cells. Immunological surveillance, we talked a little bit about that. We haven't looked at interferons or complement. We'll look at that a little bit. Inflammation, we've talked about inflammation before in ANP1, and then finally fever. Look at see how that works. All right, so here's a nice image sort of showing all of these different components, and I'll sort of go back and forth to it. So physical barriers, phagocytes, immunological surveillance, interferons, complement, inflammation, and fever. And so this is a nice chart because it sort of gives a brief description of each of the 7 components, and then also it has sort of an illustration to go with it. So I'm going to go back to this as we sort of work through these. All right, so the first one of these non-specific defenses I mentioned are physical barriers. So the skin, the hair, any epithelial layers and these internal passageways, all these things are going to be a way of protecting ourselves, right? Because it's a physical barrier. Not only is it a physical barrier which can protect it from these pathogens, there are secretions, right, that can flush away these materials like sweat glands and mucus and urine, or other types of secretions, right, like stomach acid or enzymes that can kill or inhibit microorganisms. So these are all important ways physical barriers work. Not only is it just a physical barrier, but as you guys remember from AMP1 when we talked about the integument, there are secretions that also provide defense in that way. Okay? And so that's important to understand that distinction. The second category of these non-specific defenses are phagocytes. And phagocytes serve as the first line of defense, right? They actually typically are the first things to respond, removing cellular debris and responding to a different pathogen. And there are basically two classes, although they act pretty similarly, macrophages and microphages. Microphages are like neutrophils and eosinophils. You guys talked about those back when we looked at the blood and you identified those different types of cells. They essentially leave the bloodstream, enter the peripheral tissues, and they can then migrate to wherever that location is. Macrophages are more larger phagocytic cells derived from monocytes. They distribute throughout the body. They're either free or fixed. Fixed, stay at a specific target, for example, in the dermis or in the bone marrow, whereas free macrophages are wandering. They have the ability more to travel throughout the body. Okay? Activated macrophages, and once they're activated, respond to pathogens in several ways. As I said, they can engulf, consume, and destroy it with lysosomal enzymes, right? But they can also bind a pathogen and release chemicals that attract other cells to that target. This is called positive chemotaxis, where it sends off chemicals into the fluid, and other cells of immunity recognize this and go to that target as well. So it's a pretty cool way our body is able to defend those cells through this positive chemotaxis. All right? So anyways, that's what happens when the macrophages are activated. All right, next one in these non-specific defenses is what's called immunological surveillance. And this, as we talked about before, is carried out by these natural killer cells. Natural killer cells identify and attach to whatever the abnormal cell that they're targeting is in a non-selective fashion. The Golgi apparatus of the natural killer cell forms these porphyrin vesicles. The vesicles then release these proteins via exocytosis. Porphyrins then destroy or lyse the abnormal plasma membrane of the target and kills and destroys the cells in that fashion. Okay? And so you can look at these steps in this visual as well. First is to recognize and adhere to that appropriate location. So here is your natural killer cell here. Here is the target it's going for, right? And so it recognizes and adheres to that target. Once that happens, the Golgi, remember the Golgi? Golgi apparatus is something that produces secretory products. Golgi realigns so that these porphyrins can be released via exocytosis, right? And these porphyrin molecules then will attach to that abnormal cell and perform lysis. Lysis is then destruction of that target, right? And so that's how these natural killer cells target and destroy those cells. All right? All right, another one is immunological surveillance of cancer cells, as I was mentioning. These are natural killer cells that recognize cells with tumor-specific antigens, and the natural killer cells try to target them as well. However, cancer cells can be very tricky little guys, unfortunately. They have many, many little tricks. And if you ever get the opportunity to take a cancer biology course, I highly encourage it because it's very fascinating. Even though cancer is so, taking such a significant toll on health and is really a horrible thing, obviously. From a scientific standpoint, it's pretty fascinating how these cancer cells are able to avoid destruction from our immune system. And they do what's called immunological escape. And they are able to avoid cancer cells by giving off different pathogens and other types of things to avoid being damaged and destroyed. Okay? Viral infection cells infected with virus will present abnormal proteins on the membrane, and that allows the natural killer cells to identify them and then to destroy them. Okay? All right, another way our body, again, is non-specifically defending itself is through what are called interferons. Interferons are proteins released by lymphocytes that basically trigger the production of antiviral proteins which slow the spread of viruses. So interferons can be very helpful in terms of the viruses. And I'm going to try to write this. I'm not very good at this pen. Sorry about that, but that's the other thing to do, right? They're going to help with viruses. There's different types, alpha, beta, and gamma interferons. Alpha interferons, and this gives a nice description. They attract and stimulate natural killer cells, right, to enhance resistance at that target. Beta interferons, which are secreted by fibroblasts, slow inflammation in that location, and then gamma interferons are secreted by T cells and natural killer cells to stimulate and help macrophages sort of identify and target these viruses. All right, so interferons. Complement is another system. This is a pretty complex program, so I think all you really need to understand is it has these 11 complement proteins, or C proteins, that really complement, as it works, as the term indicates, antibody action. And they work sort of in a cascade of events, sort of a positive feedback loop, kind of like blood clotting does, where it gets enhanced and stronger to aid antibody action. Okay, so that's all you really need to know about complement. Inflammation, we've talked about inflammation before. It's a localized response, and it's sort of almost the initial response typically to any sort of injury or pathogen that has entered. And the signs of symptoms of inflammation, as you guys know, swelling, redness, heat, and pain, of course, occur. Inflammation has a purpose. Number one is to sort of serve as a temporary barrier, so no other things can sort of enter, and will allow other pathogens to enter that site. Slows the spread of pathogens in the surrounding areas, but also mobilizes local and systemic defenses to help with, defending, obviously, but also regeneration. Okay? So those are sort of the effects of inflammation. Inflammation can produce necrosis, which is death of tissue, right? Fortunately, most tissues in our body, they can regenerate, but there will be oftentimes necrosis or necrotic tissue at that location. Last one is a fever. Fever is body temperature maintained above 99, and the reason for fever really is because of what are called pyrogens. Pyrogens are basically any material in the body that causes the hypothalamus, which is where a thermoregulatory center is located, if you recall from Unit 1, to help raise body temperature. And raising body temperature, basically, it just makes it harder for these abnormal pathogens to survive, sort of like you're almost, cooking them out of your body, right? Raising the temperature, really elevating it, makes it harder for these pathogens to survive in these warmer temperatures. So circulating pathogens, toxins, or antibody complexes can often cause pyrogens to be released. Pyrogens then stimulate the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus then will raise body temperature. So fever is, is a defense mechanism, right? You always think as soon as somebody gets a fever, it's like, oh man, let's give them aspirin or Tylenol and lower that fever. And I think that's a good thing if your fever gets really high, obviously, but generally it's sort of part of the body's defense system to try to slow the effect of these toxins and pathogens. All right, so that is everything on non-specific defenses. Now we need to look at adaptive or specific defenses, right? Specific defenses are specific resistance or immunity, and they respond to specific antigens, right? And it's basically done through T cell and B cell activity. T cells, as we know, provide cell-mediated immunity, right, which defends against abnormal cells and pathogens, and B cells give us what's called antibody-mediated immunity. Antibodies defend against antigens and pathogens in the body and work sort of in a different manner than T cells. So we'll look at both of those and see how they work. Okay? And so here is a nice sort of flow chart that show how these adaptive defenses work. Right? You have cell-mediated pathway, right? Phagocytes and T cells are activated, and they directly attack, physically or chemical attack, to destroy the target, right? Antibodies are the result of B cells that produce antibodies. The antibodies circulate in the plasma and then destroy antigens that way. So the end goal is the same for both pathways, right? It's just one is cell-based and one is antibody-based, all right? And that's what we're going to look at next. All right, so we'll do the T cells first. We've already talked about some of this a little bit already. The major types of T cells: cytotoxic, memory, helper, and suppressor T cells. Antigens present, T cells recognize antigens that are bound to the plasma membranes of the target, right? And binding will occur when it matches that specific antigen. That's how T cells recognize the appropriate target. Okay, and so you have antigen recognition, for instance, like for instance a CD8 T cell, which we'll talk about a little bit later, encounters an appropriate target. It will recognize it. Co-stimulation happens next, where it recognizes the antigen, and before activation, the T cell must physically be stimulated by the abnormal cell. And then after it recognizes that, then we see activation and cell division. Okay, so that's really sort of the first step of how this cell-mediated response occurs. Once those cells have been activated, the T cells destroy the target in a number of ways. We talked about perforin. Cytokines can also, which stimulate apoptosis or cell destruction, or lymphotoxin, which can disrupt and destroy cell metabolism. So there are a number of ways that the cell can destroy a target, right? And they're listed there. Okay, so it's not always exactly in the same fashion. But first, these cells have to be activated, and we saw that activation and co-stimulation process, and then they go ahead and destroy the target location. Okay? All right, so cytotoxic T cells, as I said, seek out and immediately destroy target cells once they're activated. They can release perforin, as I mentioned, which destroys the plasma membrane of the target. They can secrete lymphotoxin, which is essentially a poison that destroys these target cells. But they can also activate certain genes inside the target cell, right? Alter metabolism that can also cause these cells to die. All right, so there are different ways these cytotoxic T cells work. Memory T cells then are produced with cytotoxic T cells. You go back to that previous slide. All right, memory T cells are also produced, right? Activation and cell division. So once the T cells are activated, you also produce some memory T cells for future, times if that antigen returns, right? So these stay in the circulation and will immediately form cytotoxic T cells if that same antigen appears again. So memory T cells are obviously very important and part of that initial formation of cytotoxic T cells. All right, suppressor T cells secrete suppression factors which inhibit responses of T and B cells. Again, act after the initial immune response to, slow the process, right? You don't always want your body to be, your immune system to be, quote unquote, active or constantly fighting something. You want it to be on the lookout and prepare, but you don't want it necessarily also to be in active immune response, right? That would feel crony all the time, probably. So you have these suppressor T cells that can slow that. Okay? B cells, okay, are the other way that these cells are, can work, and it's through what's called antibody-mediated immunity, right? They attack antigens by producing specific antibodies, hence the term antibody-mediated immunity, okay? Millions of population, each with different antibody molecules, are how these B cells work. And so B cells, again, go through a similar process. They go through sensitization and activation, and then finally division and differentiation, right? And that's how they are going to work it. B cells are sensitized by, recognizing an antigen and taking it into B cell processing and then reappearing on that B cell surface. Okay, so you can see what happens. There's specific antigen circulating in the body, right? This B cell will be inactive until that antigen binds to that specific B cell. Once it does that, that B cell is now sensitized to that specific antigen, right? So it's sort of like the activation of the T cell that we talked about previously. It has to be sensitized to that specific thing first before it's going to respond to it. So that's the first initial step. After that, you get activation, right? Helper T cells, as we'll call that category of T cells, help with preparation and activation of these sensitized B cells. So the helper T cells bind to the B cells, secrete cytokines that are going to promote B cell activation and division. So the B cell formation is really dependent on these helper T cells for activation, right? And so we see in this image of activation, right, the B cells and the T cell, right, you're getting cytokine co-stimulation to sort of activate that sensitized B cell, which you can see in this image here. Okay? All right. Then finally, once it's sensitized first and activated, then we start to see B cell division, where the B cell will divide into plasma cells, right, and memory B cells, right? Plasma cells will synthesize and secrete antibodies. Memory B cells, like memory T cells, remain in reserve to respond to the next time it appears, right? And so this is a nice overall view of that. You have this sensitized B cell that becomes activated, right, and it produces plasma cells which produce antibodies, right? Memory B cells are also produced that will remain on reserve to do this same process in the future, right? So that's what we have in this third step. So antibodies are really cool. There are different classes of antibodies, 5 different primary classes of antibodies, also called immunoglobulins, and they go by IgG, IgD, IgE, IgM, IgA. They're found in body fluids, and these are the ones that actually will target different pathogens and other things, antigens that enter our system. Okay? And so I just want to go through each one so you can have a snapshot of what each of these different class of antibodies are like. First one we're going to go over is IgG. IgG is the largest and most diverse class of antibodies. 80% of all antibodies are IgG. Okay? And IgG antibodies are really important, as you might guess, since they're such a large component. They're responsible for resistance against viruses, bacteria, bacterial toxins, and the maternal IgG, because they can cross the placenta, provides what we call passive immunity during embryological development, right? So that's how the mother's IgG antibodies can protect a developing fetus during that time, okay? And so that's what we see with IgG. So very common, very popular, very effective class of antibody. IgE antibody, next class we want to look for. It attaches to the exposed surfaces of basophils and mast cells, which are typically associated with inflammation. And so when antigen is bound by an IgE molecule, you're going to see a lot of release of histamine and other chemicals to increase inflammation. So when you think IgG, you can think inflammation, right? Because that's part of that, because they're associated with basophils and mast cells, which are part of the inflammatory response, as you guys know. So IgE is going to be present in allergies. We'll talk a little bit about allergies in a little bit, but this is one of the things that can cause like hypersensitivity to certain things that enter our system and excessive inflammation. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. Another class is IgD, which can help with sensitization of the B cell and binds to these antigens and extracellular fluid. IgM is another important antibody because it's typically the first antibody secreted after an antigen is encountered. So this is one we see initially, right? and then IgM will decline as IgG, which we said is a really common 80% very significant antibody, will then accelerate its production. Okay? Plasma cells secrete IgM molecules and circulates again as a sort of a 5 antibody starburst, but then over time we see a change in this, and then IgG antibodies sort of start to take over. And we'll talk a little bit about different levels of antibodies and sort of what happens in initial response. And then IgA is a very simple class of antibody that is found like in mucus and tears and saliva, and it attacks pathogens before they get to our internal tissues, right? So it's almost like a superficial defense. These IgA antibodies circulate through and provide a nice layer of protection as well. Okay? And so this visual, again, shows sort of the classes of different antibodies. They also sort of have the molecular structure here. But this is nice because it just gives sort of an overview of all 5 types: IgG, IgE, IgD, IgM, and IgA. So just make sure you have a nice snapshot understanding of all these different 5 classes of antibodies. All right. Let's see. I think you don't have to worry about the 7 functions of antigen-antibody complexes. But what I do want to talk about is the primary and secondary responses to antigen exposure. This is sort of an interesting concept in terms of what happens during these both cell and antibody-mediated immunity. You have a first exposure and then the next exposure, right? First exposure obviously is going to produce the primary response, and the next exposure will trigger a secondary response. Secondary response is typically more extensive and prolonged, and as you know from what I said previously, those memory cells are primed and ready to go. So that's a very common thing because oftentimes we're going to see a lot of the same bacteria and other types of things, pathogens that enter our system, and so our body is sort of on the ready for those as they enter. And so in the primary response, this takes time to develop, right? Antigens have to activate B cells. The antibody titer level slowly rises as those plasma cells differentiate, right? The primary response, you start to see obviously a peak response that's going to take maybe several weeks to develop, right? And IgM is produced faster than IgG, but is less effective. So IgM, again, will be the thing that we'll see first, and then IgG will take over. So your typical primary response, this is time down here. So here's 1 week, 2 weeks, etc. This is how much antibody is in the serum. And as you can see, almost takes about a half a week before anything even enters in terms of antibody concentration. But over time, the IgM goes up, you can see, by the first week and peaks. IgG, which is your more effective, more robust amount of antibody, doesn't even really get to any significant level until around the first week. And then by the second week, that will peak, right? And you can see IgM will then start to go down. IgG levels will even out. So that's our primary response that we see in IgM and IgG. Okay? The secondary response is activating of the memory B cells, right? This is after we've already had this and we've already sensitized to the specific pathogen. And so we activate these memory B cells, right? These are lower antigen concentration than the original B cells, but they secrete massive quantities typically. So you get a much larger, more robust response, and it's much faster. And so now look at the antigen level. This is our time here. This is the antibody level here. And look at that. Right off the bat, IgG is going way high, much more than what we saw previously, right? And IgM is about the same, not a whole lot different there, but look at the IgG response, much greater. So you see a big difference in the primary versus secondary response. That's why our body's able to tolerate it a little bit better. Okay. So the effects of these memory B cell activation, the IgG, as I said, will rise very high and very quick and remain elevated for an extended period of time. IgM is a little bit quicker and slightly extended, but not significantly different than we saw at the primary response. This is more of a secondary type of response that's occurring here. Okay. All right. So combined responses to a bacterial infection, neutrophils and natural killer cells again begin killing bacteria. Cytokines will draw the positive chemotaxis, draw more phagocytes into the area, and this antigen presentation stimulates helper and cytotoxic T cells, as you guys know. B cells will become active, and so the antibody levels are going to go up, right? And so that's how our body is going to respond to bacterial infection. And so this is a very complex slide, but you don't have to like memorize exactly what this is, but you can sort of see this is the body's what happens in terms of immune activity in the body. So neutrophils go way up initially, as you guys know. Natural killer cells, of course, are going up. The antibodies, as we saw previously, are slower to enter in the system, but we do have our cellular response. You have this combined, right, between cellular response and antibody response for bacteria. Viral infections, pretty similar, but cytotoxic T cells and natural killer cells are activated by those virus-infected cells, right? And so here you can see a nice flow chart of what happens with bacteria and then with viruses. So just sort of review that. You don't have to go into great detail on this section. All right. So on to sort of a different topic. Now we're going to look at development, right? How can our body protect itself? As I said, some of our immune system we're born with, and it's pretty consistent throughout our life, but other immune components develop over time, right? And so the fetus can even have somewhat of an immune response after exposure to an antigen at like maybe 3 to 4 months, but as we talked about before, a lot of that is coming through passive immunity, okay? And so the development of this immunological competence comes from the thymus, as we talked about, the bone marrow for the B cells, and then IgM antibodies. Okay? Before birth, again, as we talked about previously, maternal antibodies can pass through the placenta and provide what we call passive immunity to the fetus. After birth, we know that the mother's milk can provide IgA antibodies, right? And so that's when you lose that passive immunity. If breastfeeding, that's sort of one of the, I hate to say the word arguments, but people that are big proponents of breast milk is that they have these mothers naturally produce IgA antibodies in them, and that can be passed along to the newborn since they're losing that passive immunity, obviously, because the placenta is no longer there at that time. Okay, so that's important with immune system development. Okay. Normal resistance starts to occur. The infant will produce IgG antibodies after exposure to antigens. Antibody B cell and T cells will slowly rise, right, as we age to about age 12. And that's why, again, during those younger years, the kids are getting colds and stuff, right, and sick and illnesses, right, and GI bugs and all kinds of stuff, right, because their body just is learning all these things, right? They're learning and identifying these different things sort of as they go through. But over time, these levels will rise, right, to adult levels, and you have a little bit more of a competent, normal resistance that occurs maybe by around age 12. Okay. All right. So another category that we can look at are immune disorders. As I was mentioning before, we've talked about autoimmune disease. There's also an immunodeficiency disease like HIV, and then allergies can be where we have this hyperactive, sort of very sensitive response to certain things that enter our system. Okay? So autoimmune disorders, basically we've talked about these before, like back in AMP1, like for instance, type 1 diabetes is thought to be an autoimmune disorder, right? Because the cells of this lymphatic defense system, for whatever reason, they are targeting those islet cells that produce insulin, right? And instead of recognizing those islet cells as being normal, healthy cells and beneficial to the body, they are targeting, in type 1 diabetes, these cells, these islet cells, as being like pathogens. Like they've recognized it for whatever reason as a pathogen, and they target and eradicate it. So then that person can no longer produce insulin, and obviously we've talked about the effects of that. So autoimmune disorder then is a malfunction of the system that recognizes and ignores normal antigens, right? And so activated B cells make autoantibodies against the body's normal healthy cells. So rheumatoid arthritis is another one, diabetes, as I was mentioning. These are things where the body is attacking normal cells and tissues in the body. Okay? Immunodeficiency disease, again, like HIV, right, which could ultimately turn into AIDS, although with drugs and other types of things we've been able to sort of manage that a little bit more. But these is where we see, problems with lymphatic tissue and other cells in our body. Immunosuppressive drugs often can, help manage these, but, immunodeficiency, not being able to defend yourself, and so you can get sick very easily with these types of diseases. And then finally, allergies, right? Inappropriate, excessive immune response to antigens and allergens that are things that obviously are triggering these allergic type of reaction. There are different types of allergic reactions. What I'd like to look at is just a type 1 allergy, right? This is probably the most common thing we're all most familiar with is immediate hypersensitivity. And so type 1 allergy is a rapid and severe response to a given type of antigen, right? And it's the most commonly recognized type of allergy, like environmental allergies or peanut allergies, other types of things are becoming so much more common now. And the reason these can be, type 1 allergies can be so impactful, as we said before, we were talking about IgE antibodies, right? Sensitization leads to production of these large quantities of these IgE antibodies that are distributed throughout the body. And for whatever reason, in response to that, a second exposure leads to massive inflammation and release of these tissues, and so you get a really strong sensitized response. Why? It seems that, things like peanut allergies and other types of allergies are much higher than they used to be. Why is this happening? We're not sure. Why is autoimmune happening more than it used to? We're not exactly sure. But anyway, type 1 allergy is a good example of how that works. Okay? Now, the reason type 1 allergies can be so dangerous is what's called anaphylaxis. Anaphylaxis can be fatal. It affects cells throughout the body. It can cause capillary permeability changes, which would produce like swelling or hives on the skin in response to this allergen. What makes it very difficult is smooth muscles of the respiratory system contract. You guys know smooth muscles can constrict, and it's going to make breathing very difficult. Peripheral vasodilation can cause circulatory collapse, which is what's most dangerous, and that's anaphylactic shock. So that's why when kids have peanut allergies, people are so concerned about it, because some have such a strong sensitive response that can happen, anaphylactic shock. So it's a pretty severe, like bee stings, those types of things can be fatal for certain kids that have this really strong response. And this just sort of shows the mechanism of anaphylaxis, the allergen fragment, B-cell sensitization, and the formation then of IgE antibodies at the first exposure, right? And then subsequent exposure, you start to see massive stimulation of these cells, excessive release, and as a result of that inflammatory process, you get histamines and other chemicals that cause inflammation, capillary dilation, airway constriction, etc., and potentially anaphylactic shock. All right? Now, antihistamines things like Benadryl or things can really help relieve mild symptoms of immediate hypersensitivity, right? The antihistamines block histamine release from mast cells, right? Makes sense. That's what's causing a lot of inflammation in a lot of these processes. So that's why that can be very effective. For more mild symptoms. If you're having a really extreme response, you probably have heard, and it was just in the news recently about EpiPens, right? Because the price was going up so high. But EpiPens can be life-saving, because EpiPens, epinephrine, right? Sympathetic stimulator that can block airway constriction, for instance, right? Make it a little bit easier for the child to breathe. Okay, and that's in a very severe case. Benadryl for more mild response, EpiPen for in that really severe response. All right? All right. Moving on, we can talk about a few other very interesting components about the immune system. One is stress in the immune response. Okay, stress is, part of our normal responses, right? Stress releases glucocorticoids that limit the immune response, right? When your body is in a stressful scenario, it's not concerned about immune or defense. It's concerned more with dealing with the stressful scenario. So the glucocorticoids limit their immune response. Glucocorticoids like hydrocortisone, for instance, we talked about this before. That's why it's a cream that can rub on your skin to limit inflammation or hives or things like that on your skin, right? Because it limits the immune response. Well, that goes across the board. So long-term stress or long-term secretion of glucocorticoids, right, as a result of chronic stress, can inhibit the immune response and then lower resistance to disease. So being stressed all the time, having a stressful, sort of sympathetic response a lot, right, chronically, can inhibit your immune response, and then you can be less able to resist disease. So stress, while a normal process, needs to also be managed so that it's not constantly occurring. So glucocorticoids, as I said, depress the inflammatory response, reduces the number of phagocytic activity, reduces interleukin secretion, so all these things are going to slow and depress the immune response. Okay? In regards to aging, immune system diminishes as we get older, as I've said. There are different reasons for this, but we're basically more vulnerable to infections and especially cancer, right? That's why cancer rates are so much higher when you get older, because our immune system is not as robust as it is when we're younger. And you can see the reasons for that, right? Thymic hormone production is greatly reduced. We said the thymus atrophies, right, as we get older. So if you have less of a thymus, you're not going to be producing as many hormones. Those thymic hormones help educate those T cells, and so as a result, the T cells are going to become less responsive to these given antigens. Fewer T cells reduces the effectiveness of B cells, right? We said there are helper T cells that help those B cells become divide and differentiate, so you're going to have fewer B cells. And then also immunosurveillance is going to decline because you have fewer of those natural killer cells. So really across the board, you're seeing a reduction in T cells, primarily because of the atrophy of the thymus as we age. Okay? All right. That's pretty much it. Don't worry about these last two slides. You can just sort of glance at. But that pretty much gives us everything we need to see with this chapter. So that's a lymphatic system defense. Make sure you're reading along in the text as well. That'll be a nice complement to what I've gone over. And that's it.